Okay, AP, we're going to pick up on chapter 8. We have this lecture, then one more lecture, and this unit, this unit will be done. So we're going to pick up at sort of a Bailey oddity. I don't know if anybody noticed it, but they showed a picture of George Washington, at least in my edition. I hope they continued this crazy tradition. Bailey, for whatever reason, gives the metric height of George Washington 1.88 meters, and he does this for every single president. He doesn't do it for other people. He only does it for the presidents. He decides that, one, he's going to list the height, and he's going to list it in standard and metric. So that's different. So ladies and gentlemen, George Washington is leader of the Continental Army, but we're hoping not to have a revolution. And then we have the events at Bunker Hill. So we're raising this army. We're actually raising several armies. And they talk about how Ethan Allen and Benedict Arnold surprised some forces in Upper New York, British forces, and not only take forts, but steal their gunpowder. This is huge. This gunpowder is going to be used to take back to Boston and try to take, and they do take, control of this hill called Breed's Hill, but they mislabeled it at the time, so everybody thinks it's called Bunker's Hill. That's fine. They take this gunpowder and they create a defensive position from which they are firing down on the British troops that are still stationed in Boston. And the British decide, okay, step one, we've got to remove these troops. So these rebels, really, from their perspective, we're not even soldiers at that point to them. So let's see if we can show you. Okay, we could share this screen. I'll come back to this a little bit, but I want to show you a little bit of the idea of flanking. So boy, you know I'm a bad artist, so this is going to be ugly. But you know that the American colonial Minutemen are on top of a hill. That's obviously a strategic advantage whenever you're on top of a hill, because you're firing down and people have to work harder to go up. So American troops are at the top of this hill in several lines. Now, what standard sort of military procedure would be instead of sending all your troops, and let's say each line represents 500 men, you would never just send all your men straight up the hill because the top of the hill is such a huge advantage. What you do is you try to flank them. So flanking would work like this, and I'll get into this when you're in person in class. You might have some troops here to kind of hold a counter defensive position, but you send more troops to one part, to one edge. And what you try to do is outflank part of the line held by your enemy. What this does is, one, the British outnumbered us anyway, but even if you don't, you can create one area in the battlefield where you outnumber your enemy. Here's the crazy thing. The British knew they should do this, but they didn't bother because they just figured we would run away because we're just cowardly American colonials. So they just simply marched straight up the hill without bothering to try to flank. That's crazy because what they did was put them in essentially a shooting gallery, and they ended up losing, I believe it's 3,000 men. They launched a frontal attack with 3,000 men. My apologies. And they absolutely got mowed down. Now, I'm sure they didn't all get killed. And we absolutely held the position until we ran out of gunpowder. We ran out of gunpowder, we just retreated. That's all we did. That's, to us, we've got so much geography. We can trade, as the book says, space for time all day long. And as Ben Franklin says, and I don't think the quote is in this book, I think I picked this up from another quote, in the time that it took from when we first occupied Bunker Hill until the British finally took it over, America had 60,000 babies. You can't win this war. We're peopling too fast. You can't win this war in the long run if we don't lose our will to fight. So let me roll back up to some of these highlights too, and I'll hopefully refer to this a few times. But these are colonial highlights then of the war, especially early on. And we've talked about Lexington and Concord, the events that occurred there. And we talked about the Second Continental Congress choosing George Washington, Benedict Arnold, and Ethan Allen picking up gunpowder, Breed's Hill, 1775, and we're about to talk about the Olive Branch Petition. Notice this little point here. Assume any gaps in the timeline, the British are destroying us. Yep. I mean, they are just destroying us in any of these gaps. And you notice there's a pretty big gap between 1777 and 1781. there are a lot more. There are a lot more than just a couple battles fought in this war. But this isn't a focus class just on the American Revolution. And we have a tendency to highlight Trenton and Saratoga and Yorktown because those are our successes. Boy, there are way more failures. But again, we can survive this war as long as we continue the will to fight, because they're the ones fighting on a foreign land and trying to conquer people against their will. So it's tough for them. But we make our own situation harder by having some poor strategies. We decided that we were going to invest considerable amount of effort into invading Canada, which sounds crazy. But there is a logic to it. And the logic would be the French Canadians can't be excited about being taken over by the British. I'm sure they'll revolt with us. They'll be a 14th colony, and together we'll be that much stronger. But what they forgot is the Quebec Act. Because of the Quebec Act, the French Canadians were like, actually, we were treated pretty well, just as well as we were before. They have no angst against the British, at least not to fight what they perceive to likely be an absolute failure or losing attempt by us. Because again, you still wouldn't bet on us. That would not be the wise bet. So we go into Canada and attack them thinking they won't even put up a fight. They'll want to join us, and they did not. So we have the Irish-born General Montgomery, who used to fight for the British, fighting for us, and he captures Montreal. Quebec, the other stronghold, is not as easily as taken. General Benedict Arnold ran out of food for his men, and they had to be reduced to, quote, eating dogs and shoe leather during their grueling march. And he was wounded and nearly killed in that battle. This goes to some of the background as to why Benedict Arnold eventually is going to feel unappreciated and willing to take a bribe from the British to become a traitor. He suffered greatly for the colonies, for the American cause, and he did not feel that he was appropriately respected. And then you just have this sort of scattered fighting here and there. You have Virginia town in Norfolk being burned to the ground. You have a town in Maine being burnt to the ground. You have some patriots having some success in South Carolina. That's fine, but we're still not fighting. We're still not technically what we're fighting. We're not technically at war. We are still telling the king we'd love to be your loyal subjects as we shoot at his soldiers. That's when this gentleman by the name of Thomas Paine releases this very famous pamphlet. And it is a pamphlet, not a book, because if you see here, this is pretty narrow. And half of this is actually basically an academic look at this. So it's really less than that. But it is a very influential pamphlet called Common Sense, in which Thomas Paine says, what are we doing? What are we doing here? Clearly we're going to rebel. Why don't we just declare our independence and do this thing? We know that we're different from the British. We know that we don't feel British because we haven't been for generations. We know that we are different, that we have grown up different, that we have different really values and ways of life. Why are we pretending that this is going to work? Let's break up already. Let's do this. And secondly, while we're doing this, let's not pick some new king. Let's have a republic. We are uniquely situated and uniquely raised, or uniquely, sort of our life experiences are unique to the idea of we don't really have a true aristocracy here. Why don't we keep that uniqueness? Why don't we make it so that we have this representative republic that can go over this vast territory so that as we expand, we can still have this representative government, as opposed to a direct democracy where you have to be right there and everybody votes. So he's got this dual idea of independence and a republic, and this sweeps through the colonies, and people are absolutely taken by it. And it does, just like the title sounds, a lot of people are like, this is sort of common sense. And so eventually the Second Continental Congress moves that these states ought to be independent and free. That was actually done by Light Horse Lee, who is a direct descendant of General Lee from the Civil War. I assume it's his grandfather, but I feel like I read that it was his father, but boy, the age doesn't seem to work out right there. But either way, this is a direct descendant or a direct relative of Lee's that said we should declare it. But the Congress wanted to have this Declaration of Independence be a really powerful sentiment to unite the American colonials and to really let the British know what was up. Just as importantly, attract the attention and the support of foreign nations who might be willing to help us. So who would we put in charge of this? Well, we actually make a committee. I think there's 5 members of the committee. Ben Franklin's on the committee. But let's be honest, the person who wrote this thing is Thomas Jefferson. Thomas Jefferson was known as being probably the most intelligent person in the colonies, a great thinker, a great mind. We'll learn later, and it'll be pretty obvious here. Conflicted, we'll say, with his values, hypocritical, very fair to say, but a genius. Side note, before I get into his genius and some of his oddities, like, he invented a lot of things, like the Lazy Susan, that thing that there's 2 versions. There's the one you could put on your table. So if you have ketchup and somebody says, I want ketchup, you can just spit it around. There's also the one that's in the corner. If you have cabinets and you've got one in the corner and you don't know what to do with that corner space, it's the cabinet that spins around in that corner. He invented that. He invented the dumbwaiter, so that you could make food on one floor and pull it up by a string and it shows up on the other floor. Stuff like that. A copy machine where you could write one copy of a letter here and a pen attached to a line, a stick, wrote another one over here. All kinds of crazy stuff. But this, which is going to be very hard to see, is a breakdown of a study a professor did from, let's see, the University of California. Now, I will say not everybody accepts the results of this study. It's pretty fascinating, but some people say, he's a little off here and there. What this guy was trying to do is determine the IQ of people who never took an IQ test. We have, and he was trying to compare our presidents. But what he was essentially trying to do was use their letters and other things to sort of guesstimate what their IQ would be. The first thing I'll say is IQ is a very imperfect measure of people's intelligence. I think it measures a specific type of intelligence. I do pretty well on IQ tests. I took a bunch in college for various classes. And, you can feel pretty smart. But there are lots of scenarios where I'm really dumb. It just measures a certain type of intelligence. But this guy looked at our known IQs, because a lot of our presidents obviously grew up at a time when IQ tests existed, and then sort of guesstimated these other ones. And he came up with the fascinating conclusion, which I think is very interesting, that every single president, even our dumbest presidents, are in the top 2.2% of the American public. In other words, there have been no dumb presidents. They've been dumb compared to other presidents. But nope, they've all been highly intelligent, top 2.2%. Now, his study goes through George W. Bush. So Barack Obama and Donald Trump just didn't make the cut because this study was done before that. I bring it up because, we're talking about some really smart people here. And some of the higher ones, Theodore Roosevelt, Woodrow Wilson, Jimmy Carter. But your highest ones, John F. Kennedy, Thomas Jefferson, and John Adams. Thomas Jefferson had a projected IQ of 160. Some people have projected it even higher. That, I believe you're a genius. Is it over 135 or 140, 145, somewhere there? I mean, he's way above. He did this for other historical figures, by the way. Leonardo da Vinci came out at 220. So wrap your head around that one. What I'm trying to say here is Thomas Jefferson's a pretty smart guy. And he is going to write this document that is heavily influenced by the Enlightenment, by his study of the Enlightenment, his tremendous belief in the Enlightenment, and he does an amazing job. Now, there are edits that are done. We have copies of their first and second drafts of this. We know Ben Franklin's handwriting. We know that Ben Franklin specifically wrote things in the margins. The famous line, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. We know originally it was life, liberty, and property. And that Ben Franklin wrote, not everyone's going to be able to have property. And then it was life, liberty, and happiness. And Ben Franklin wrote something along the lines of, there's some people that are never going to be happy. So it's amazing to see sort of this process. But I'm just going to read through a couple of the highlights. The intro is pretty powerful. When, in the course of human events, it becomes necessary for one people to dissolve the political bonds that have connected them with another, to assume among the powers of the earth the separate equal station to which laws of nature and of nature's God entitled them, a decent respect to the opinions of mankind require that they should declare these causes which impel them to separation. We hold these truths to be self-evident. All men are created equal, and they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, and that among those are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Killer. Now, is it hypocritical? For sure. But I'm going to make my pitch for the Declaration. Thomas Jefferson wrote these words. First off, he's not, although our forefathers in many ways leave women out, he's not necessarily leaving them out by saying all men are created equal, because I do believe he's referencing here mankind. So I'm gonna give him a slight pass on that. Ladies, if you don't want to, I understand, but I truly do believe that there. But there's no doubt Jefferson and other forefathers owned slaves. Jefferson, and we'll get into this history later, absolutely, we have the DNA evidence, had children with Sally Hemings, a slave. So how do you have the hypocrisy to say all men are created equal and then not follow through, not live a life that shows you value that? And it's problematic, for sure. Here's what I would argue, though, about the general concept. Our forefathers set forth these documents, the Declaration and the Constitution, knowing that these documents aspired for ideals that were better than us, that were better than they were, and they are better than us. They are what we can be. They are what we can aspire to be. We have not lived up to our ideals in many occasions in U.S. history. I do believe the trend has generally gone upward, but there is no doubt you can make really solid arguments here, and here in history for long stretches of time where we do not live up to these ideals. But you want a government that at least is trying to live up to those ideals. We need to do better in many cases. You're not going to get any argument from me about it. But these ideals, not our forefathers. Our forefathers were people with lots of faults. But we're people with lots of faults too. And again, not excusing them, just saying they did put together some documents that allow us to aspire to something better than than any individual person is. I do not revere these men as amazing men. I think of them as very interesting men, very intelligent men who had very serious faults. But I do revere the documents that they created, because these are ideals we should be aspiring for. It goes on and says here, let me give you the facts, these candid facts, but it does say too, whenever any form of government becomes destructive to these ends, it's the right of the people to alter this government, to revolt. So some of the things they complain about: for quartering large troops among us, for cutting off trade with other parts of the world, for imposing taxes without our consent, for depriving us in many cases of the benefits of trial by jury. Last paragraph: we are appealing to the supreme judge of the world for the rectitude of our intentions, due in the name of the authority of the good people of these colonies, solemnly publish and declare that these united colonies are and ought to be free and independent states. Ladies and gentlemen, they are appealing to the world because the British don't care. They know the British aren't going to care. The British say, that's it, you're in revolt. You're in revolt. If you're caught, you will be treated as a traitor. That's why signing this was a big deal. You put your name on this thing. You now can be treated as a traitor, which means that if you're caught, you will be drawn and quartered. I can't remember if I've talked about this in this. I think I did. I think I talked about it with Native Americans. Metacom, I think we talked about him being drawn and quartered. I mean, we're talking about opening up your chest with a knife, not killing you, pulling out your internal organs, lighting them on fire on your chest, then tying 4 horses to 4 limbs and saying, giddy up, and then beheading the chunk that has your head. This is awful. So we are taking a big step. So John Hancock putting his name real big, we make a big deal out of that. I think he's just making a point, like, I'm not afraid to sign this, but listen, signing it big, I don't know. What are you gonna quarter him a little extra harder? I mean, anybody who signs this thing is in big trouble. And so this is the statement to the world. This is what we're doing. This is why we're doing it. But it doesn't mean, like so many people get confused, like, oh, we declare our independence and then we're independent-ish, because the British don't accept it. So we have to fight then for that independence. That's the war for independence. That's what's next. July 4th, 1776 marks our declaration, because that's when it was officially accepted. It doesn't mark our independence. It marks the start of the war then. You could say we're independent because we're trying. Just think about it like this. If you just, right after this lecture, turn around and tell whoever your loved ones are, I declare my independence. I'm out of here. Cool. You think you're going to win that fight? Because there's about to be a fight. And you're probably not going to win it. Even my seniors who are close to 18, you're not winning that. You don't want to win that. You don't want to be independent yet. Trust me. I wish I'd stayed home longer. So just because we declare it doesn't mean we have it. It means we declared it. So now the British are, that's it. We're done. We're on a full-scale war. The war for independence has begun. And this is going to be tough for us because, as we said, 1/3 at best are actively supporting this revolution. 1/3 are actively supporting the British, the loyalists. And 1/3 are like, yikes, I don't know. I don't know what's going to happen here. The book then does like a breakdown, which shouldn't be surprising at all. Wealthier people tended to be loyalists because the system was working for them, but not all wealthy people. Some of our most important forefathers were pretty wealthy. Washington was wealthy. Jefferson was wealthy. But the average colonial soldier, not wealthy. In general, if you were affiliated with the Anglican Church, you were, you were more likely to be loyalist. The Church of England, essentially, which eventually becomes the Episcopal Church. You'd be more likely to be loyal to the English. All of the people who, are descendants of those Puritans, they're far less likely to be there. New England in general, you're far more likely to be a patriot. The South, a lot more loyalists. Now, a lot of loyalists, 50,000 at least, fought for the British. A lot of loyalists left, a couple 100,000 left, but a couple 100,000 stayed behind. And of those that stayed behind, for the most part, they were not abused. There were some abuses, but for the most part, they were not. There's just too many, honestly. So this is going to start the war. Now, the rest of this, and really much more so tomorrow's lecture, will cover some of these battles. But right out of the gate, the British decide they're going to make their base of operations Canada and New York, but in the colonies, New York. New York has a great bay for all of their ships to come in, and they quite quickly, by 1776, have amassed 500 ships, 35,000 men. Washington has 18,000 men. Now, there's more than one British army, and there's more than one colonial army. We're going to talk a lot about the main armies. They're little, Ethan Allen has a force here. Benedict Arnold has a force here. But the main colonial army is under the command of Washington. The main army of the British, it's going to transfer hands from time to time, but there's more than one army fighting in one place, but we'll focus on these main armies. But Washington in 1776 gets just destroyed at the Battle of Long Island, and he retreats. And he escapes to Manhattan Island, crosses the Hudson to New York, and finally the Delaware. The famous painting is actually about the 26th. But the British are so close, they play a fox hunting call. So, they're taunting him. All Washington is doing effectively early on is retreating. Howe probably could have crushed him right there. But Howe was in command at Bunker Hill, and he remembered what was going on. He remembered what he had experienced. He's like, I'm not going to rush this. We don't need to work hard to beat these guys. In addition, Howe had this problem. So I'm going to read this directly from Bailey. This is fantastic. The country was rough, supplies were slow in coming, and a professional soldier like Howe did not relish the rigors of winter campaigning. He evidently found it more agreeable to have the bedtime company of his mistress. The wife of one of his subordinates, a scandal which American satirists had a good bit of fun with. Yeah, I could see where that would be something you might draw a few political cartoons about. So he's in no particular hurry. He's like, what am I going to run around in the winter and chase Washington for? He's going to lose. He's got no chance. So Washington, now that he realizes that he's successfully retreated and is not going to be crushed right then, has a Christmas truce. But on the On December 26th, he crosses back the Delaware, that's the famous painting, 1776, and surprises 1,000 Hessians who had been sleeping off their Christmas celebration. So he attacks these Hessians like just hours after this truce, and there's some speculation or disagreement about whether or not the truce was supposed to carry on beyond that. And even the Hessians, who were totally surprised, do rally, but one of his sharpshooters snipes the Hessian commander and shoots him in the head, and he's on horseback when this happens. Like the whole battlefield sees it, and the Hessians are like, "Oh, we're just here for money," and they put down their arms. And so that's a victory. And then you have something similar happening. Small encampment at Princeton is captured. We have clever things. Campfires are being left lit here, and we're doing clever things to win these little battles. Washington is not going to be able to engage the enemy and beat the main army on any battlefield. Not happening this early in the war. Barely happens at the end of the war because everything kind of went perfectly. His strategy is to retreat, maintain an army that is a threat that the British have to deal with, and win these small skirmishes using every clever trick he can come up with. And that he is effective at. And so that's where we'll leave it for now. We will fly through the rest of the battles of this war tomorrow, and that will finish up. Now, we do not have school on Wednesday, so you guys get some extra time in the scheme of things because we have one more, hopefully just one more, teacher professional day, I think, to prepare for our live return on October 19th, if you make that choice. And we're working on what to do if you choose to stay at home. So we'll work through all that, but one more lecture for this particular chapter and we're all set. Hope everybody has a great day and keep up on those essays.